12 Days at Winterbourne Manor. Chapter 1. The First Snowfall. Miss Anne Felbridge arrived at Winterbourne Manor on the second day of Christmas, beneath a sky the colour of pearl, from which snow fell steadily and without drama. It suited her frame of mind exactly. The carriage rolled up the long beach-lined drive, its wheels muffled by fresh drifts, and Anne leaned back against the worn velvet seat with a small, private breath of resolve. She had promised herself, quite firmly, that she would enjoy this visit in the proper manner. She would be useful, she would be agreeable, she would observe, but not expect. Above all, she would not imagine herself of consequence in a house where consequence had already been carefully apportioned. Winterbourne Manor rose ahead of her in pale stone dignity, its many windows glowing with lamplight against the winter afternoon. Wreaths of holly and laurel framed the great doors. Ribbons in Ashcroft blue were tied with restrained elegance rather than festive excess. The Ashcrofts did nothing carelessly, nor did they do it loudly. Anne had known this long before she accepted the invitation. She was not, strictly speaking, a guest invited for her own sake. She was a useful cousin, the quiet, sensible relation whose presence smoothed company, assisted older ladies, and filled gaps in conversation without demanding attention. When Lady Ashcroft's letter arrived in early December, written in her graceful slanted hand, Anne had read it with clear understanding. "My dear Anne, we shall be gathering a full house for the 12 days, and I should value your presence greatly. You are always such a comfort, and I know you enjoy the country in winter." Comfort. Enjoyment. Neither word suggested romance or consequence. Anne accepted readily. Now, as footmen hurried forward and the carriage door was opened, she gathered her muff and descended with care. Cold air brushed her cheeks. Snow dusted the hem of her sensible grey travelling cloak. The manor doors opened, releasing warmth, candlelight, and the faint sound of voices within. "Miss Felbridge," announced the butler, with perfect neutrality. Lady Ashcroft herself emerged from the inner hall, tall, composed, her silver-streaked hair dressed with understated elegance. She took Anne's gloved hands with genuine warmth. "My dear girl, how good of you to come in such weather. You must be chilled." "Not at all, Aunt," Anne replied, smiling. "The journey was quite smooth." Lady Ashcroft's eyes, keen and kind, swept over her niece with approval. Anne was neatly dressed, as always. No fashion-leading embellishments, no ill-chosen colours, nothing that required comment. "You will find the house already lively," Lady Ashcroft said. "Henry has persuaded his cousins to attempt charades after supper, and heaven help us all." Anne smiled again, and this time felt a flicker of genuine anticipation. She had known Henry Ashcroft since childhood, knew his easy manners, his polished charm, his ability to enliven a room. He had always been kind to her, though never particularly attentive. She did not resent this. It was simply the natural order of things. She followed Lady Ashcroft into the great hall, where the warmth of many fires chased the cold from her bones. Garlands trailed along the staircase. Greenery adorned the portraits of Ashcroft ancestors, who stared down at the living with varying degrees of sternness. "Henry is walking with Mr. Caldwell at present," Lady Ashcroft continued as they moved toward the drawing-room. "They will return before dusk." Anne inclined her head. She did not ask why Henry might be walking when the house was already full. She would learn in time, as she always did, through observation rather than inquiry. The drawing-room held several ladies engaged in embroidery and quiet conversation. Miss Lydia Trent, a distant cousin with bright eyes and brighter ambitions, rose at once. "Anne, how very good of you to come!" Lydia exclaimed with affectionate enthusiasm. "We are to have skating tomorrow, if the frost holds." "That will be pleasant," Anne replied, "though I fear I shall be more observer than participant." Lydia laughed. "You always say that, and yet you never look bored." Anne smiled and took the offered seat near the fire. It was true. She was rarely bored. She enjoyed watching people, how they spoke, what they avoided, the subtle shifts of expectation beneath polite discourse. At Winterborn especially there was much to observe, for this was the year everything was meant to be settled. She had heard it long before she arrived, in the careful tones of her mother's last letter and the knowing glances of other relations. Henry Ashcroft, heir to Winterbourne Manor, was to announce his engagement before Twelfth Night. The lady in question, Miss Clara Montgomery, was expected to arrive within days. Anne thought of this without envy. Clara Montgomery was beautiful, accomplished, and perfectly suited to Henry's position. She herself was neither remarkable nor strategically placed. She was content to witness happiness from the margins. And yet, when Henry returned just before dusk, snow clinging to his coat and his expression unusually subdued, Anne noticed. She noticed the faint tension in his smile, the way his gaze passed over the room as though seeking refuge rather than admiration. She noticed that when he finally saw her, standing quietly near the window, his shoulders eased, just slightly. "Miss Felbridge," he said, approaching with genuine warmth. "Winterborn is improved by your presence." Anne laughed softly. "You flatter me, sir." "No," he replied, with a seriousness that surprised her. "I speak from long experience." It was nothing, merely kindness. Yet as they exchanged polite remarks, Anne felt, without understanding why, that these days at Winterbourne Manor would not unfold quite as expected. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Chapter 2. Quiet Conversations. By the 4th day of Christmas, Winterbourne Manor had settled into its seasonal rhythm. Mornings were reserved for brisk walks, correspondence, and the measured enjoyment of winter sunlight filtering through frost-etched windows. Afternoons brought games, music, and the careful intermingling of company. Evenings, lit by candle and fire, invited conversation that hovered delicately between propriety and intimacy. Anne moved through it all with her accustomed ease. She assisted Lady Ashcroft with household matters, sat patiently through extended discussions of ribbon and receipt, and listened attentively when others spoke. She skated briefly, walked often, and read by the fire when company overwhelmed her. It was during one such afternoon, when most of the house had gone out in pursuit of fresh air, that Henry Ashcroft sought her out. Anne was seated in the smaller library, a room less formal than the great study, its shelves filled with well-used volumes and its windows overlooking the west garden, now silvered with snow. She had been reading without much concentration, content in the quiet, when she heard footsteps pause at the threshold. "Miss Felbridge," Henry said, hesitating. She looked up at once. "Mr. Ashcroft, is something amiss?" "No, nothing of consequence," he replied, stepping inside and closing the door against the chill. "That is, I wondered whether you might care to walk. The others have gone toward the river, but I thought the west path might be less crowded." Anne considered him for a moment. He did not meet her gaze immediately. His usual ease was absent, replaced by a careful politeness that suggested effort rather than habit. "Of course," she said, rising and setting aside her book. "I should be glad of it." They walked in companionable silence at first, their steps crunching softly over the snow. The west path wound between bare hedges and slumbering rosebeds, leading eventually to a stand of evergreens that sheltered them from the wind. It was Henry who spoke first. "You are very observant, Miss Felbridge." Anne glanced at him, mildly surprised. "I hope I am not offensively so." "On the contrary, it is a rare and valuable quality." He paused, then added, "You see things without demanding to be seen yourself." She smiled faintly. "That has often been my role." He stopped walking then, turning to face her fully. The winter light caught the seriousness in his expression. "I should like your counsel." Anne felt a momentary tightening in her chest, not of fear, but of unexpected weight. My counsel. Yes, he exhaled slowly. I find myself at a crossroads, and I do not trust my own judgment. This was new. Henry Ashcroft was not a man known for uncertainty. Anne considered her words carefully. If I may be of any assistance, you have only to ask. He hesitated again, then gestured toward a fallen tree nearby, half buried in snow. They sat, careful of damp, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. At the end of these festivities, he said at last, I am expected to make an announcement. Anne nodded. I had supposed as much. You see, he said, with a faint, rueful smile, you miss nothing. I miss many things, she replied gently, but not what is spoken of openly. He laughed quietly, then sobered. The engagement is entirely suitable. Miss Montgomery is accomplished, agreeable, and well regarded. Our families are aligned in every respect. And yet, Anne prompted softly. And yet, he echoed, I find myself uneasy. The word was insufficient, but it was all he offered. Anne did not rush to reassure him. She had learned long ago that true confidence did not require immediate comfort. Do you admire her? She asked. Yes. Do you respect her? Very much. Do you wish to marry her? Henry looked down at his gloved hands. Snow gathered silently around them. I wish, he said slowly, to do what is expected of me. I wish to be worthy of Winterborn. I wish to make my parents proud. Anne listened. But I do not know, he continued, voice low, whether that is the same as wishing to marry her. Anne felt something stir within her, sympathy, certainly, but also a faint, unbidden ache. She pushed it aside at once. Then perhaps, she said carefully, you must ask yourself what you believe marriage ought to be. He looked up at her then, searching her face. And, what do you believe it ought to be, Miss Felbridge? She was unprepared for the question. Anne had long since trained herself not to dwell on such matters, not where her own prospects were concerned. I believe, she said after a moment, that it must contain honesty, not merely between husband and wife, but within oneself. He regarded her with something like wonder. That, he said quietly, is precisely why I wish to speak with you. They resumed their walk shortly thereafter, conversation returning to safer ground. Yet something had shifted between them, not into impropriety, but into trust. And Anne, sensible as ever, told herself that this was all it was. Chapter 3. The Unraveling. Miss Clara Montgomery arrived on the 8th day of Christmas. She came in a flurry of admiration, her carriage scarcely halted before the house filled with renewed energy. Clara was every inch the admired guest, graceful, warm-voiced, and possessed of that effortless charm which drew attention without demanding it. Anne observed her with calm appreciation. Clara was, she thought, genuinely kind. She thanked servants by name, listened attentively, and laughed easily. She suited Winterborn well. Henry, however, grew quieter. Anne noticed it first during supper when his conversation faltered despite Clara's animated efforts. Later, during music, he stood apart, watching rather than participating. When Anne caught his eye across the room, he smiled faintly, but there was strain beneath it. She told herself this was none of her concern. Yet the confidences continued. On the 10th day, they found themselves once more walking together, this time in the long gallery, its windows dark with evening. A storm raged outside, snow driven hard against the glass. I am running out of time, Henry said abruptly. Anne stopped. Henry. She had never used his given name before. It startled them both. He did not rebuke her. Instead, he turned toward her fully, his expression open, unguarded in a way she had never seen. I dread Twelfth Night, he admitted, I dread the expectation, the applause, the certainty of it all." "And Clara?" Anne asked, though her heart beat painfully. "She deserves more than reluctance," he said. "She deserves a man who greets his future without doubt." Anne nodded, swallowing. "You cannot marry her out of obligation alone," she said softly. "That would be unkind, to her and to yourself." "I know." His voice was strained, but to refuse would be to upend everything. My parents, Winterborn, it would be a scandal of the quietest, most damaging sort. Anne looked at him then, not as the heir, not as the charming gentleman, but as a man cornered by his own sense of duty. "And what do you desire?" she asked. He did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I desire the peace I feel when I speak with you." The world seemed to tilt. Anne felt her breath catch, her careful composure falter. This was not what she had expected, nor what she had permitted herself to imagine. "Henry," she said very quietly, "you must not say such things." "I must," he replied, "because they are true." She turned away, struggling for equilibrium. "I am not," she began, then stopped. How could she finish? "I am not suitable. I am not important. I am not to be loved." "You are everything I am not meant to choose," he said, anguish plain in his voice. "And yet, you are the only person who sees me clearly." Anne closed her eyes. "I cannot be the reason you abandon your duty," she said at last. "Nor will I be the comfort that allows you to endure a choice you resent." He stepped closer, but did not touch her. "Then, what am I to do?" She turned back to him, steady despite the ache in her chest. "You must choose honestly," she said, "and accept the cost of that choice, whatever it may be." They parted that evening with restraint and resolve. But the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Chapter 4. Twelfth Night. Twelfth Night arrived with clear skies and brittle cold. The manor was illuminated in its full splendour, candles blazing, garlands refreshed, anticipation thick as the scent of pine. Guests gathered in the great drawing-room, their conversations tinged with expectation. Anne stood near the edge of the room, hands folded, heart calm in a way she did not expect. She had resolved herself to whatever might come. Henry stood beside his parents, composed, dignified, his expression unreadable. When he stepped forward, the room quieted. "My friends," he began, voice steady, "I am grateful to you for sharing these days at Winterborn. They have reminded me of the value of honesty, kindness, and true companionship." Anne felt her breath still. "I had intended," Henry continued, "to make an announcement this evening. However, it would be dishonest of me to do so under false pretenses." A murmur rippled through the room. "I have the deepest respect for Miss Montgomery," he said, turning toward Clara, whose expression was composed though pale. "But I cannot offer her a future that is not wholehearted." Silence fell. Anne did not look at Clara. She could not. Instead, she stared at the floor, heart pounding. Henry drew a breath. "I have learned, in these days, that love is not always what is expected of us, but it is what we must answer to if we are to live with integrity." He turned then, not to Clara, not to the assembled guests, but to Anne. "Miss Felbridge," he said, voice firm despite the enormity of the moment, "I do not know what the future holds, but I know that I would rather face it honestly with you than live comfortably without truth." Anne's vision blurred. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze. The room seemed to fall away. "I cannot promise ease," she said softly, "nor can I promise to be remarkable." "I require neither," he replied, "only that you walk beside me." Lady Ashcroft stepped forward then, her expression unreadable. "Anne," she said after a moment, "you have always been a comfort to this family. Perhaps it is time we recognized how greatly." The tension broke, not into chaos, but into quiet acceptance. Clara, dignified to the last, took her leave with grace. The guests adjusted, as guests always do, and Anne Felbridge, sensible, observant, long overlooked, found herself at last seen. As the bells rang out over Winterbourne Manor, marking the close of Christmas and the beginning of something new, Anne stepped into the snow beside Henry Ashcroft. The days at Winterbourne Manor had changed them both, and neither wished them undone. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the little bell so you are notified the moment the next story is published. Until our next edition, may your days be filled with grace and your nights with the promise of romance.